Have you ever agreed to something that sounded like care, looked like love, and yet felt wrong the moment you crossed the threshold? The kind of wrong that doesn't scream but settles quietly in your chest and refuses to move. Because that was how it began for me, not with shouting or cruelty, but with a soft voice on the phone telling me not to worry, that I wouldn't be alone anymore, that family takes care of its own. Words that felt safe enough to lean on when my body had just betrayed me, when a mild stroke had left my legs unreliable and my confidence thinner than I cared to admit, because when you've spent a lifetime being competent, respected, needed, the most dangerous thing isn't weakness. It's believing help will look the way it's supposed to. And I believed it. I believed my son when he said it would only be temporary. I believed him when he said they had space. That it would be easier if I stayed with them for a while. That doctors didn't like seniors living alone after something like this. And I told myself that needing help didn't mean I had become helpless, that this was just a pause. A small adjustment, nothing more, because for 47 years I had walked into courtrooms with my head high, carrying files that held other people's lives inside them. I had organized chaos, calmed trembling witnesses, corrected judges twice my senior without raising my voice. And when I retired, they gave me a plaque and a standing ovation, not out of pity, but out of respect. And that version of me still existed, even if my body had slowed. Even if my gait was careful now, even if my mornings started with pills and quiet instead of schedules and urgency. So when I packed my things, I didn't pack fear, I packed dignity, folded neatly between sweaters and sensible shoes. And when I arrived at my son's house in Pennsylvania, I noticed the little things first. The way the front door opened without warmth, the way his wife didn't stand up from the table when I walked in, the way conversations paused just a second too long before resuming, and you might think those are nothing, but silence has texture when you've lived long enough to recognize it, and this one felt tight, rehearsed, like a room holding its breath. Still, I smiled because that's what women like me do. We make things easier, we don't demand space, we earn it quietly, and the first night passed without incident. A polite dinner, a short conversation, a suggestion that I should rest. Because recovery takes time, and I agreed, because I didn't come to disrupt their routine, I came to fit into it, but fitting in is hard when no one has cleared a space for you. And by the second day, it was already clear that my presence was not an addition. It was an inconvenience being measured, discussed, and eventually solved, because that's how it happens, not all at once, but piece by piece. Until you realize you are no longer a guest, you are a problem, and problems require solutions. And the solution came over breakfast, casual, efficient, delivered without eye contact, when my son said, almost apologetically, that things were a bit cramped inside, that everyone needed breathing room, that it would just be for a little while, that I'd be fine out there. The garage was dry, he said, insulated. He even smiled when he said it, as if comfort could be transferred through tone alone. And I remember staring at him, searching his face for hesitation, for discomfort, for something that would tell me he understood what he was asking, but all I saw was relief. The kind that comes when someone else agrees to make themselves smaller so you don't have to feel guilty. And his wife didn't soften it, she sharpened it, said the house needed peace, said stress was bad for everyone, said I should think of it as temporary, like a test, and tests, she said, build character. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap. Because what do you say when your own child decides where you belong without asking if you can survive there? What do you say when gratitude is expected for being pushed out of sight? And I told myself not to react, not to dramatize, not to be difficult, because women like me were raised to endure first and question later, to be grateful even when generosity stings. And so I nodded, because nodding was easier than admitting the truth that had begun to form in my chest. That help had come with conditions, that love had come with limits, that I was no longer seen as a person returning home, but as a body that needed to be stored somewhere convenient. And as I followed him to the garage, past shelves of forgotten tools and boxes no one had opened in years, I realized something that settled deeper than fear, deeper than humiliation, something colder, and it was this. No one puts something they value in a garage, not carefully, not thoughtfully, not without plans to retrieve it later. And that was the moment, standing there with the smell of dust and oil in the air, that I understood this wasn't about space or recovery or time. It was about removal, quiet, polite, bloodless removal. And I didn't protest, because part of me still believed that if I endured long enough, if I didn't complain, if I proved I wasn't a burden, I would be invited back inside, because that's the lie endurance whispers to us when dignity is on the line. And I laid down that first night telling myself it was temporary. telling myself tomorrow would be different, telling myself family wouldn't let this go too far. But even as I closed my eyes, the question I couldn't silence followed me into the dark, pressing harder with every breath. If this is what help looks like, what happens when they decide I need less of it? And that question, unanswered, waiting, was what kept me awake, because deep down, I knew the garage wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning, and by morning, I would learn just how cold silence can become when it thinks no one is listening. I thought the invitation had been the hardest part, but the first night in the garage taught me something far worse, because cold doesn't just attack the body, it teaches you exactly where you stand. What happens to your sense of self when the door closes behind you and no one is on the other side waiting to check if you're all right? Because that was the moment everything shifted for me, not when I lay down on the narrow folding cot. Not when I realized there was no heat running, but when the sound of the house disappeared, replaced by a hollow quiet that felt deliberate, like silence chosen on purpose, because silence can be a form of instruction, telling you exactly how much space you're allowed to occupy. And that first night in the garage taught me more about my place in their lives than any argument ever could. The cold arrived quickly, seeping through the concrete floor and climbing into my bones with a patience that felt personal. And I layered every sweater I owned, pulled the thin blanket up to my chin, and stared at the ceiling beams where paint bubbled and cracked, counting them the way you count seconds when you're waiting for something to end. But the night didn't rush, it settled in, heavy and slow, and every sound outside felt amplified, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the occasional creak of the house expanding and contracting with the temperature, all reminders that life continued warmly just beyond the wall I was leaning against, and my body, still recovering from the stroke, protested the cold in ways I hadn't prepared for. My legs stiffened, my fingers numbed, my back ached where the metal bar of the cot pressed into it, and as I curled inward, instinctively protecting my chest, I felt something worse than pain settle in, the realization that I had been placed somewhere no one planned to visit, because garages aren't spaces you check on, they're spaces you forget, and I tried to tell myself this was temporary. That tomorrow would bring adjustments, maybe a space heater, maybe a conversation, maybe regret, but endurance has a way of stretching time, making minutes feel like hours and hours feel like a test you never agreed to take. And the more I lay there, the more memories crept in, uninvited but persistent, because when the present offers no comfort, the mind retreats to proof that you once mattered. I remembered courtrooms filled with voices, the rhythmic tapping of keys, the weight of files in my hands, the way judges leaned toward me when they needed clarity, the way people listened when I spoke, and the contrast between that life and the one I was living now felt unbearable. Because how does someone go from being relied upon by an entire system to being stored behind a door like seasonal equipment? And sometime after midnight, when the cold had worked its way past the layers and into my joints, I heard movement inside the house, footsteps, muffled voices, laughter drifting faintly through the wall, and that sound did something cruel, because it reminded me that my isolation wasn't accidental, it was curated, they were warm. They were comfortable, and they had decided I would not be part of that anymore. And when morning finally came, it arrived without kindness, no gradual light, no warmth. Just a gray chill and the realization that my breath was visible in the air, that my hands trembled when I tried to sit up, that my body needed time it was no longer being given. And when my son finally opened the garage door, squinting as if surprised to see me still there, he asked if I was okay in a voice that sounded practiced, not concerned, the kind of voice people use when they want reassurance without responsibility, and I nodded. Because nodding was easier than explaining that my back hurt, my chest felt tight, and my pride had cracked in places I didn't know could break, and he said something about getting a heater soon, about checking the breaker, about later. Always later, and then he closed the door again, and as the latch clicked, I heard his wife's voice from inside the house, low but clear enough to cut through the wall, saying something that froze me more deeply than the temperature ever could. Something about how this was better, how this way there would be fewer complications, fewer decisions, fewer things to manage, and I stayed still, pretending not to hear, because when you realize people are discussing your decline as a convenience, there is no safe way to react, and I sat there afterward, wrapped in my robe, breathing in the smell of dust and cardboard, wondering when exactly I had stopped being a person and started being a problem that needed containment. Because it doesn't happen all at once, it happens quietly, with reasonable words and careful tones, until you find yourself sleeping somewhere you never would have placed yourself. And by the second night, the cold felt sharper, more intentional. Like it had learned my weaknesses, my joints protested more loudly, my cough lingered longer, and still I said nothing, because I was raised to endure, to not make trouble, to be grateful for whatever space was given. And yet, somewhere between the ache in my bones and the sound of laughter echoing from the house again, something inside me shifted, a small but undeniable awareness that this wasn't just discomfort, it was erasure. Because people who plan to keep you safe don't place you where survival feels optional. And as I lay there listening, waiting, counting the hours until morning again, I realized something unsettling. Something that made my heart pound despite the cold. They weren't waiting for me to recover, they were waiting for me to weaken. And that realization followed me into the early hours, sharp and unrelenting. Because once you understand that silence is being mistaken for surrender, you can no longer afford to stay quiet. And that night, as the garage settled into darkness again, I didn't sleep the way I had the night before. I listened. Carefully, because endurance had ended and awareness had begun. The cold wasn't the most dangerous thing in that garage, because by the second night, I realized they weren't just waiting for me to leave, they were waiting for me to fail. What if the people closest to you weren't waiting for you to get better, but quietly watching for signs that you were slipping? Because that realization doesn't arrive with panic, it arrives with clarity, and clarity is far more dangerous, especially for those who assume you no longer possess it. And by the third morning, I understood something that reframed every cold hour I had spent in that garage. They weren't testing my endurance, they were measuring my decline. Listening for confusion, watching for hesitation, hoping the cold would do what guilt could not. And the way I realized it was simple, unremarkable, almost boring, which is how the most important truths tend to arrive. Because that morning I woke before dawn, my joints stiff, my throat sore, my body aching in places I didn't have names for. And as I sat on the edge of the cot rubbing my hands together for warmth, I heard voices through the thin wall. Not raised, not angry, just practical, like people discussing groceries or schedules. And that was the part that made my stomach tighten, because cruelty delivered casually is always calculated, and my son's voice came first, tired. Frustrated, complaining about how long this was taking, how he hadn't expected it to be like this, how he thought I would last maybe a night or two, and his wife answered calmly, almost soothingly, saying patience was important. That these things took time, that the lawyer had explained it clearly, and the word lawyer sliced through the quiet like a blade, because that word doesn't belong in conversations about care, it belongs in conversations about control, and I stayed still. My heart pounding, my breath shallow, because when people talk about you as if you're not there, it's usually because they've decided you don't count as a witness anymore. And then I heard the word that changed everything, not shouted, not emphasized, just dropped into the conversation like it was inevitable, guardianship, and my fingers curled involuntarily. Because that wasn't a misunderstanding, that wasn't stress talking, that was a plan. And suddenly every decision made sense. The garage, the isolation, the lack of heat, the quiet waiting, because confusion doesn't need to be forced when conditions are right. It just needs to be encouraged, and they were encouraging it carefully. Methodically, hoping the cold, the discomfort, the exhaustion would blur my edges enough for someone else to step in and speak for me. And that was when something unexpected happened. Fear loosened its grip. Because fear thrives on uncertainty, and now I knew exactly what was happening. And knowing, even in the cold, is power, and I realized they had made a critical mistake. They had assumed silence meant confusion. They had assumed endurance meant ignorance. They had assumed age meant absence, and they were wrong, because while my body had slowed, my mind had not. And every word they spoke through that wall landed clearly, sharply, arranging itself into a picture I recognized all too well. The picture of people laying groundwork, creating a narrative, preparing paperwork, and I had spent nearly 5 decades watching narratives rise and fall in courtrooms. I knew what manipulation sounded like when it dressed itself up as concern. I knew how people spoke when they believed the outcome was already decided. And as I sat there listening, a strange calm settled over me. Because I understood something vital, they thought I was fading, but I was watching. And that distinction mattered, because the most dangerous person in a room is not the loudest one. It's the one everyone assumes is no longer paying attention. And all day long, I played my part perfectly. I moved slowly. I spoke little. I thanked them when they left a plate of food just inside the garage door without looking at me. I nodded when my son asked if I was managing. And each small act of compliance made them more comfortable, more careless, because people reveal their intentions fastest when they think they've already won. And by evening, they had stopped whispering altogether. They spoke freely. laughing at how stubborn I was, joking about how tough I'd always been, and that toughness, they said, would make this easier in the end, because tough people eventually give in. And as I lay there that night, the cold pressing against me like a question, I realized something else. They weren't just underestimating me, they were relying on it, because underestimation is the foundation of every quiet betrayal. It allows people to do terrible things while telling themselves they're being reasonable. And I thought about all the times I had seen this play out in court, the way abusers framed themselves as caretakers, the way exploitation hid behind responsibility, the way victims were dismissed because they didn't look distressed enough, because they didn't scream, because they didn't collapse, and I understood then why my silence unsettled me. Not because it made me weak, but because it made me invisible, and invisibility is useful to people who want to act without consequence. And that was the moment my strategy changed, because survival was no longer enough. Endurance was no longer the goal. The goal was preservation, not of comfort, but of truth, and truth requires witnesses, evidence, memory, and I had all three, even if they didn't know it yet. And as the night stretched on and the house grew quiet again, I stopped counting the hours until morning and started counting the moments I needed to remember. Every word, every tone, every assumption they made about my capacity. Because they believed the garage had reduced me, that it had stripped me down to something manageable, but what it had actually done was remove distraction. It had given me time, clarity, and purpose, and when you combine those three things, you don't fade, you focus. And as I closed my eyes, not to sleep but to think, I made a decision that felt heavier than any legal file I had ever carried. Heavier because it involved my own blood, but just as necessary. I would not confront them, not yet. I would not argue, not yet, because confrontation without leverage is just noise, and noise is easy to dismiss. But proof changes the temperature of a room instantly. And they had no idea that while they were waiting for me to weaken, I was preparing to remember everything, and that preparation, quiet and invisible, was already underway. They thought silence meant surrender, but by the third night, silence had become my strategy, and the garage was about to turn into evidence. What if the quietest person in the room isn't confused at all, but cataloging everything? Because that was the shift they never noticed, the moment my silence stopped being endurance and became intention. And by the fourth morning, the garage no longer felt like a place I was surviving in. It felt like a place I was observing from, because once you understand what's being done to you, fear loses its grip and something steadier takes its place: precision. And precision had been my language for most of my life, even if they'd forgotten that, and I began with something small, almost invisible, the kind of thing no one thinks twice about: my watch, a simple gift from my granddaughter. Meant to count steps and monitor heart rate, nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, except that it also listened when asked. And as I sat there on the cot, wrapped in layers, my breath still visible in the air, I pressed the face gently once, twice, until the screen blinked, a signal no one else could see. And in that moment, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because recording isn't about revenge, it's about accuracy, and accuracy is what people like me were trained to protect. And from that point on, I stopped reacting and started documenting every footstep outside the garage, every conversation that drifted through the thin wall, every careless remark delivered with the confidence of people who believe no one is listening. And it didn't take long, because confidence makes people sloppy, and sloppiness always leaves a trail, and that afternoon they had guests. Voices unfamiliar, louder, more relaxed, the kind of voices that come with beer bottles and laughter. And I heard my son explaining the situation like a joke, calling it temporary, calling it practical, calling it necessary. And when someone asked if I was all right, he laughed and said I was tougher than I looked, that I'd always been stubborn. And his wife added casually that the garage was the best place for things like this, because it kept everything contained. And the word contained echoed in my head, because people don't use that word for loved ones. They use it for problems. And I pressed the watch again, another quiet blink, another piece preserved. And that night, when the house settled and the garage fell silent except for the hum of the heater that never came, I reviewed what I had captured, listening through my old tablet, the one I'd nearly left behind because they'd said I wouldn't need much. And the sound was clear, their voices unmistakable, their intent unmasked by familiarity. And as I listened, something else returned to me, something I hadn't felt since before the stroke: competence, not physical, not loud, but internal. The knowledge that I knew how to handle this, because evidence doesn't argue, it doesn't plead, it waits. And once I had that, the garage changed again. It was no longer just a place of isolation, it was a vantage point. And I used it the way I'd used every quiet moment in my career, to prepare. And I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, not because we'd drifted apart, but because life has a way of placing people on shelves until they're needed again. And when she answered the phone, her voice steady and familiar, I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I simply said I needed help and that I had proof. And she understood immediately, because women who have spent their lives watching the system work also know exactly when it fails. And from there, things moved quickly, not dramatically, but efficiently. Messages sent, files shared, timelines established, and for the first time since arriving at that house, I felt protected, not by walls or warmth, but by process, and that protection did something unexpected. It made me patient, because when you know the next move, you don't rush, you wait for the right moment, and I waited, letting them believe their plan was working, letting them grow more comfortable, more careless, because people always reveal the most when they think they're in control. And they spoke freely now about doctors, about paperwork, about how long things usually take, about how exhaustion makes people agreeable. And I listened, not with anger, but with focus, because anger clouds memory. And memory was my greatest asset. And as the days blended together, cold mornings and quiet afternoons, I built a record, not just of what they said, but of how they said it, the jokes, the dismissals. The way my humanity had been reduced to logistics. And somewhere in that process, the humiliation lifted, replaced by something steadier, resolve, because humiliation feeds on secrecy, and secrecy had been removed. And by the time the third night arrived, I knew enough not just to protect myself, but to expose what they had done, and still, I said nothing, I nodded, I smiled. I thanked them when they slid food toward the garage door without meeting my eyes, because the most effective strategy is often the least visible. And when I lay down that night, the cold pressing against my back, I didn't feel alone. Because I wasn't, not anymore, the truth was with me, recorded, preserved, undeniable, and that truth was already moving through channels they didn't know existed. And I understood then why they had been so confident, why they hadn't worried about consequences, because they believed age erased credibility, that time softened authority, that silence meant absence, and they were wrong on all counts. And as I closed my eyes, listening to the house settle, I didn't wonder how long I could last in the garage. I wondered how long they would last once the evidence left it, because the cold they had placed me in had done the opposite of what they intended. It hadn't weakened me, it had sharpened me. And sharp things, when used carefully, change outcomes. They thought the garage had broken me, but by the time the sun rose again, everything they'd said in confidence was already on its way to the one place they feared most. Have you ever stepped into a room knowing that nothing in it belonged to you anymore? Not the furniture, not the air, not the assumptions. Because that was the feeling I carried with me when I stood up on the third morning, pulled on my coat, and decided I would no longer wait to be acknowledged. I would be recognized. And there is a difference between those two things that only becomes clear when you've been ignored long enough to stop asking for permission. Because power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just walks back inside. And when I opened the garage door that morning, the cold followed me like a witness, clinging to my clothes. My breath still visible as I crossed the threshold into the kitchen. They had said I was suffocating, and neither of them looked up at first, because people rarely look at what they believe is already handled, already contained, already finished. And that was their mistake, because I wasn't there to argue, I wasn't there to explain, I wasn't there to plead. I was there to deliver something, and delivery is always calm, always precise, always final. And when my son finally noticed me standing there, he frowned, asked if I needed something, his tone impatient, distracted, as if my presence was a minor inconvenience interrupting his morning routine. And I remember thinking how strange it was that he could still speak to me that way, even now, even after everything. But then I realized he still believed the story he'd told himself, that I was fragile, confused, manageable. And stories like that collapse the moment facts are introduced. And facts were what I placed gently on the table between us. A sealed envelope, thick, official, heavy in a way paper rarely is unless it carries consequence. And I didn't explain it, I didn't announce it, I simply slid it forward and said, "This concerns me, because clarity doesn't need embellishment," and he laughed at first, actually laughed. Because laughter is what people use when they think they're safe. And he tore it open casually, scanning the first page, still smiling until his eyes slowed, then stopped, then widened, because recognition has a physical reaction. And his wife stood up then, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, demanding to know what was happening. snatching the papers from his hands, and the room shifted in a way I felt immediately. Like a temperature change you don't notice until your skin reacts, because the language on those pages didn't match the story they'd been telling themselves. Words like neglect, coercion, unlawful conditions, emergency injunction. Phrases that don't belong to people who think they're in control. And my son looked up at me then, really looked, for the first time since I'd arrived, and in his eyes I saw something unfamiliar, not anger, not guilt, but uncertainty. Because uncertainty is what appears when the ground you're standing on turns out to be borrowed, and he started talking quickly, saying there had to be a mistake, that I was confused, that I didn't understand what I'd signed. That this was all blown out of proportion, and I let him talk because when people panic, they reveal how little they prepared for resistance. And his wife tried a different approach, sharp, defensive, accusing me of betrayal, of embarrassment, of airing private matters, and I remember thinking how strange it was that cruelty becomes private the moment it risks exposure. And then there was a knock at the door, firm, unmistakable, the kind of knock that doesn't ask to be ignored. And everything stopped, words hanging in the air unfinished, because that knock carried authority with it. And when the door opened to reveal the officer standing there, clipboard in hand, expression neutral but resolved, the illusion finally shattered. Because authority doesn't argue, it enforces. And as the officer read the order aloud, slowly, clearly, the words landed one by one: no contact, temporary removal, investigation pending, immediate compliance required. And I stood there listening, hands folded, breathing evenly, feeling something unexpected rise inside me. Not triumph, not relief, but alignment, the quiet satisfaction of things finally making sense again. Because systems work when evidence is respected, and evidence had done its job, and my son didn't look at me anymore. He stared at the floor, his defiance leaking out of him in real time while his wife paced, arguing, insisting this was unfair, that she was being punished for trying to help. And the officer raised a hand and reminded her that explanations could be offered later through proper channels, because this was no longer a family discussion, it was a legal matter. And that sentence alone erased everything they had tried to reduce me to, because legal matters don't belong to the strongest voice in the room, they belong to the truth. And within an hour, they were packing, moving through the house quickly, angrily, gathering belongings under supervision, and I watched without satisfaction, without cruelty, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about correction, about restoring balance, about reclaiming space that had been taken under false pretenses. And when they left, the house fell silent in a different way than the garage ever had, not hollow, not cold, but open. And I sat down at the kitchen table they had once said I didn't belong at, rested my hands on the surface. And for the first time in days, felt warmth reach me without asking, because warmth returns naturally when you're no longer hidden. And as I sat there, I understood something important, something worth remembering. Endurance is not weakness. But endurance without boundaries is permission. And the moment I stopped enduring quietly, everything changed, and that morning didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a reset. The beginning of consequences catching up to decisions made in private. And as the day wore on and the reality of what had happened began to ripple outward, I knew this wasn't over, because truth rarely stops where it's first spoken, it travels. And what had happened in that house was already moving beyond it, toward places they could no longer control. I thought reclaiming the house would be the end of it, but that morning was only the first ripple, and when the story left those walls, the consequences became impossible to contain. What happens when something meant to stay hidden finally steps into the light, because truth behaves differently once it's no longer confined to walls and whispers, and I learned that quickly after the house fell quiet. After the garage door stayed open and no one rushed to close it, after the story I thought had ended inside that kitchen began moving on its own, carried by people who recognized it, because cruelty rarely exists in isolation. It echoes, and the first echo came as a phone call, calm, professional, asking if I was willing to confirm details. And I remember sitting there with the receiver in my hand, wondering how many times I had answered calls like that for other people. Never imagining one day the questions would be about me, about where I slept, about why a garage had been deemed appropriate, about what had been said when no one thought it mattered. And I answered simply, not because I was rehearsed, but because facts don't need rehearsal. And once those facts were spoken aloud, they didn't belong to me anymore. They belonged to anyone who had ever been told to be grateful for neglect. And the response was immediate in a way I hadn't anticipated. Because when stories like mine surface, they don't shock people, they awaken them, and letters began to arrive. emails first, then handwritten notes. From women who recognized the cold, who recognized the language of inconvenience disguised as care, who recognized the quiet shame of being stored away, and each message carried the same undertone: relief. Not that something terrible had happened, but that someone had finally said it out loud. And while the attention grew, consequences followed just as steadily, though not loudly, because consequences rarely announce themselves either. They simply remove access, withdraw trust, close doors that were once open, and my son learned that faster than he expected, when calls stopped being returned, when meetings were postponed indefinitely, when his role in the community quietly disappeared without explanation, because institutions move slowly but decisively when their image is threatened by truth, and his wife fared no better. Because words spoken casually tend to sound very different when replayed in formal settings, stripped of humor, stripped of context, stripped of justification, and suddenly phrases that once earned laughter now carried weight. And that weight settled heavily, not just on reputations, but on futures, and through it all, I remained still, not because I was afraid, but because stillness had become my strength. I watched as the story traveled, not in a straight line, but outward, touching people I would never meet, changing conversations I would never hear. And that was when I understood the true cost of what they had done. It wasn't just personal, it was systemic, because when someone like me is dismissed, it's not because I'm alone, it's because the assumption exists that no one will notice, and noticing changes everything. And I was asked more than once if I felt vindicated, if I felt satisfied, and the truth is, satisfaction was never the goal. Safety was, dignity was, prevention was, because if my silence had protected only me, it would have meant nothing, but my voice, used carefully, could protect others. And as the days passed, I began to see how many others had been waiting for permission to speak, waiting for proof that being quiet didn't mean being wrong. And each conversation reinforced something I had learned too late for myself, but just in time for others, that discomfort becomes abuse the moment it is justified instead of addressed. And I also saw something else, something harder. The unraveling, because accountability is rarely clean. It pulls at threads people didn't realize were holding everything together. And when those threads snap, the damage is real. Children ask questions, families fracture, narratives collapse. And I felt the weight of that because I had never wanted destruction, only acknowledgement. But acknowledgement has consequences whether we want them or not. And in the midst of all this, something unexpected happened. My world grew smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because I no longer centered my life around those who had diminished me. Larger because my experience now connected me to people far beyond that house. Far beyond that garage, people who saw themselves in my restraint, in my patience, in my refusal to scream. And as I listened to their stories, I recognized the pattern again and again, the same words, the same excuses, the same quiet push toward invisibility. And I realized the story wasn't just about what had been done to me. It was about what happens when endurance is mistaken for consent. And that realization changed how I carried myself moving forward. Because once you understand that your silence can either protect an abuser or expose a pattern, you choose differently. And by the end of that week, the house, the garage, the kitchen table had become symbols rather than locations, symbols of something far more common than people like to admit. And I knew then that this chapter wasn't about recovery, it was about redirection. Because what I had survived wasn't meant to end quietly, it was meant to be used. And as the attention settled into something steadier, less frantic, more purposeful, I began to ask myself a different question: not what had I lost, but what had I been given back? And the answer surprised me: clarity, agency, and a responsibility I hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. Because when truth finds a voice, it looks for a place to stand. And I was no longer willing to sit down again. I thought speaking up would close this chapter, but what came next wasn't an ending at all. It was a decision about who I would become once the silence was gone. What if the strongest thing you ever did wasn't surviving, but deciding who you would be once survival was no longer the goal? Because that was the question waiting for me after the noise settled, after the calls slowed, after the story stopped being new and became something people referenced in past tense, and I found myself alone again, not abandoned this time, but choosing solitude, which feels entirely different when it belongs to you. And in that quiet, I understood that endings don't arrive with certainty. They arrive with responsibility. Because once you are no longer hidden, once your voice has been heard, you must decide what to do with the space it creates. And I chose not to fill it with bitterness, because bitterness still lets others dictate your posture, and I had spent enough time bent to expectations that were never designed for my dignity. So instead, I filled it with memory, deliberate, organized, preserved memory, the kind that refuses to be dismissed. And I began by writing, not statements, not accusations, but letters, because letters force clarity, they don't allow interruption, they don't flinch when someone looks away. And the first letter was to my son, typed careful, restrained, 3 pages long, not to wound him, but to leave a record that could not be rewritten later. And I told him the truth he avoided, that the garage wasn't the betrayal. It was the conclusion of a forgetting that had started long before, the forgetting of who carried him through fevers, who worked late nights to afford his opportunities, who asked for nothing in return except respect. And I told him that respect isn't owed forever, but it is earned through remembrance, and that forgetting, not cruelty, was what had cost him the most. And I ended that letter without forgiveness. Because forgiveness offered prematurely becomes another kind of erasure, and the second letter was shorter, addressed to the woman who laughed about inconvenience, because some truths do not require elaboration. And I wrote simply that the words she thought would vanish had not, that her laughter now lived in places she could not retrieve it from. And that was all, because consequences do not need speeches, and the final letter was the hardest. Written to a child too young to carry guilt yet old enough to sense rupture, and I told her what no one had told me when I was young, that silence does not mean consent, that questions are not disrespect, that love should never require disappearance. And when I sealed that envelope, I felt something loosen that had been tight for months, not relief, but completion, because restoration is not about returning to who you were. It's about deciding who you refuse to stop being, and my days grew quieter after that, intentionally so. I moved into a small apartment with working heat and soft light, nothing impressive, nothing performative. But every corner of it belonged to me, and I found joy in ordinary rituals again, tea by the window, books with margins still waiting to be written in, mornings that did not require endurance, and yet even in peace. Memory continued to work, because memory does not retire, it repurposes. And I began taking calls, quietly at first, from women who had heard the story and recognized themselves in it. Women who weren't sure if what they were experiencing counted. Women who slept in basements, spare rooms, garages, corners of homes they once helped build. Women who had been told to be patient, to be grateful, to not make trouble. And I listened, because listening is how truth survives long enough to be named. And I told them what I had learned too late but would now say early and often. If you're asking whether something is wrong, it probably is. And if you are being asked to disappear for someone else's comfort, you are not the problem. And slowly, without planning it, without branding it, something formed, not an organization, not a movement, but a network of memory. People reminding one another that dignity does not expire, that wisdom does not retire, that silence is only noble when it is chosen. And I was asked once, during a small talk I gave to a room of women leaning forward in their chairs, whether I regretted not screaming sooner, whether I wished I had fought louder, harder, earlier, and I considered the question carefully, because regret deserves honesty, and I answered this way. I did not scream because screaming would have let them dismiss me as emotional, unstable, dramatic, and I knew how those labels are used. I had watched them destroy credibility for decades, so instead I remembered dates. Tones, phrases, conditions, patterns, and memory, when protected, becomes evidence. And evidence does something screaming never can. It forces accountability. And as I spoke those words, I realized that this was the ending I had earned, not revenge. Not triumph, but authority over my own narrative. And if you've walked this far with me, if something in this story made you uncomfortable or seen or angry in a way you couldn't immediately explain, it may be because you recognize the cold, not of a garage, but of being slowly edged out of your own life. And if that's true, let me leave you with this: endurance is not infinite, and it should never be demanded as proof of love. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to speak before you are erased. You are allowed to remember out loud, because the quietest justice is not the one that forgives everything. It is the one that refuses to forget. And I did not scream, I did not beg, I did not disappear. I remembered, and in remembering, I stood up, and I am still standing.